Thank you for being here. Our viewers tonight won't be aware that we are sitting down for the second time in just a week. A week ago, we had an in-depth conversation about the future of reproductive health care as it relates to the Supreme Court. We finished our conversation just about an hour before we learned the tragic news of Justice Ginsburg's passing. So I want to thank you for being here again to discuss with us how this news relates to the future of reproductive health care and Planned Parenthood in specific. So thank you for taking a time again to talk with us. I wanted to start by just getting your initial thoughts on what this news means.
Well, I'm not going to pretend to try to be optimistic. I have never felt so full of despair and dread at the prospect of Roe versus Wade and all sorts of aspects of women's equal access to health care being at risk, being in dire jeopardy, as I have since the tragic news of Justice Ginsburg's death. So I think that it is, of course, we're now talking probably 24 hours before we know who President Trump will nominate to replace Justice Ginsburg. But just as Justice Thurgood Marshall, who dedicated his life to equal justice for all and civil rights and eradicating race discrimination, was replaced by another black man whose values were completely different. I think it is inevitable that now that Justice Ginsburg will, again, ironically, tragically, be replaced by a woman whose values and commitments on all sorts of issues, but in particular on women's reproductive rights, will be as dramatically different from hers as they could possibly be. So I think we have to start preparing ourselves for a very strong possibility, very strong, that perhaps even within a year, that Roe versus Wade will be either outright reversed or so substantially weakened that it's virtually meaningless. There are currently 17 cases in the U.S. Courts of Appeals involving aspects of severe restrictions on abortion or outright bans. Many of these cases come from state laws that were passed deliberately to try to create a test case to challenge Roe. And now with Justice Ginsburg gone, and her replacement most likely being someone who thinks Roe is wrong and should be reversed, I think it is, again, virtually inevitable that the U.S. Supreme Court will now take a case for the purpose of re-examining whether Roe should be retained as a precedent or eliminated as a precedent. So I think we have to start seriously strategizing for a post-Roe world and grappling with what that means.
So, considering it a foregone conclusion that President Trump will select and the Senate will confirm the new Supreme Court justice, is an outright attack on Roe where your mind goes first as the target for opponents of reproductive health care?
No, actually, I think the first threat, if the Senate can push through a nominee by Election Day, or within a few days of Election Day, the Supreme Court is hearing, I think on November 7th or 8th, a case brought by several Republican state attorneys general, joined by the Trump administration, attempting to get the court to declare the entire Affordable Care Act unconstitutional. So that is the first really big important case that the new justice may get to hear. And if the whole Affordable Care Act goes, along with it, therefore, goes any legal requirement that employer-provided health insurance has to cover family planning services and maternity care. Without the Affordable Care Act, insurers could offer policies, or your employer could offer a health insurance policy that will not cover maternity care. So I think a lot of people, the tension about the Affordable Care Act is like, oh my God, pre-existing conditions. Well, guess what, folks? Pregnancy is a pre-existing condition. If you ever have complications of pregnancy in the future, you will now have a major pre-existing condition. But it's not just about the ability of people with pre-existing conditions, including COVID, to get health insurance in the future. This is about whether insurance policies in this country, health insurance policies, will have to cover family planning and maternity care. So that's the first big issue. And then we get into then the core of reproductive rights.
And as you said, there are several cases, nearly several dozen cases, winding their way up through the justice system at the time, trying to make an outright or very substantial attack on Roe. So this race has already begun and probably has been waiting in the wings for an opportunity just like this to strike. Is that kind of how you perceive it, that opponents of Roe in particular have been just sort of waiting in the wings for the opportunity?
They've been doing more than waiting in the wings. They have been actively planning and actively working in the wings, including, and this is very important, they have been working actively to lay an electoral infrastructure groundwork in state legislatures for decades through extensive donations to anti-choice candidates, to gerrymandering. They have worked to, they have a much better ground game in the states, let's put it that way. They have understood that if Roe is reversed, that means the entire abortion battle goes to the legislatures, both in states and in Congress. And I think the advocacy groups that support women's reproductive rights and equality have tended to focus more on the courts than on state legislatures, and are frankly way behind in the state legislative ground game, and have been kind of out-gerrymandered, shall we say, in a significant number of states. So it's not just waiting in the wings. They have been preparing for the day that Roe goes in a way that I honestly do not think supporters of Roe have been. And I think that alone should be perhaps one of the most important wake-up calls here. We're starting out probably 20 years behind in the state legislative work that needs to be done now. I think the other important sort of calculus why I think that it is highly likely that the newly configured Supreme Court will reach out to take a case for the purpose of overruling Roe is that it only takes the votes of 4 justices out of the 9 on the Supreme Court to decide to hear a case. And I think it's been evident, including this past summer with the June Medical Services case, that Chief Justice Roberts has no appetite for overruling Roe, that he understands that that would cause irreparable damage to the respect for the Supreme Court as a nonpartisan institution. So when Justice Ginsburg was still alive, I think you had 5 votes on the court for not touching that live wire. And the other 4 justices, who presumably were much more interested in overturning Roe, wouldn't want to take a case for that purpose because they knew they would be on the losing end of a 5-4 vote. Well, now, even if Chief Justice Roberts still feels the same way, that overturning Roe would be the final nail in the coffin of anyone thinking the Supreme Court was a nonpartisan institution, he'd now be on the losing end of the vote to hear the case, and probably on the losing end of overturning Roe. So with a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court, particularly with, I think, 5 of those conservative justices being extremely hostile to women's reproductive rights. We now have, that group will now perceive that they finally have enough votes to tackle the big question, should Roe be overturned or not?
Mm-hmm. And on a practical sense, you know, I hate to say that's inevitable, but in the event that that happens, in a practical sense, how does that impact immediately an organization like Planned Parenthood?
Okay, well, there's some states that have, as part of their law, a law that says the minute Roe is overturned, abortion is now completely illegal in the state. So any Planned Parenthoods that are providing abortions in those states, and I'm sorry off the top of my head, I can't tick off the whole list, will have to cease providing abortions. For the Planned Parenthood affiliates, like here, that are operating in states like New York, where we have a governor and a legislature that and laws that support women's access to all kinds of reproductive health care, those Planned Parenthood clinics have to probably brace for an influx of patients from around the country who will be desperately seeking to raise the funds to come to states where abortion is still safe and legal. And one of the ways in which the advocates for women's reproductive rights and equality have been trying to organize for a post-Roe world is by raising more money for what's known as abortion funds, for organizations that raise money to provide grants for travel costs and lodging costs and abortion procedure costs for poor women to help them, afford it. And now those travel costs will become greater. The procedure costs will likely become greater because of the delays in arranging the travel. So, those are some of on the abortion front, those are some of the most immediate implications. And then you put that together with the financial strain that Planned Parenthood is already under, with its loss of Title X family planning funding, which was the major source of funding they used to provide subsidized family planning services for low-income women. Planned Parenthood made a principled decision. The Trump administration changed the rules and said that any recipient of Title X family planning federal funds could not have anything to do with providing abortion. You had to set up a separate building, completely separate staff, a separate board, separate finances. And Planned Parenthood made a principled decision that they were not going to basically abandon abortion care in order to keep Title X funding. But that's put significant financial strain on the organization. So now when you combine that and the greater challenges Planned Parenthood has in providing affordable family planning services to poor women, with the strain that many may have in now becoming besieged abortion providers in the the pro-choice islands of New York, it's going to be an extremely difficult time for Planned Parenthood.
So this is obviously a dark time for supporters of reproductive justice and reproductive health care. In an effort to not solely focus on the negatives, as one of your former law students, as I am, I know that you have a personal history with Justice Ginsburg. And I was wondering if you would, in an interest of remembering her, tell us what it was like to have her, to know her as Professor Ginsburg and then later argue in front of her as Justice Ginsburg.
Yeah, I'd love to share some of those memories. But first I want to say, and again, not everybody may know that the reason we have our Constitution interpreted as prohibiting sex discrimination is 100% thanks to Ruth Bader Ginsberg. And it wasn't all that long ago. It was in the mid-1970s when, as a lawyer, she took what was then considered a radical idea, that the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution would ban discrimination on the basis of sex, to the federal courts and the Supreme Court. It's I think everybody. That basic principle of her legacy, I do not think is going to be gone because society has come to so fully embrace it. I mean, I can't see any of the women, for example, that Trump has said he might appoint to the Supreme Court to say, that I will repudiate everything that's given me the professional opportunities I've had. But so let's remember, that monumental contribution she made to our society. And without that principle, reproductive rights would be even more in jeopardy because there's still some potential, I think, an unexplored potential to try to make equality arguments for reproductive health care access. But Justice Ginsburg, as a professor, mentor, arguing before her, I mean, she's always had a quiet, soft-spoken way, but always directly hone in on the very key issues, key facts, always expecting and inspiring you to work your hardest, do your best, don't settle for, existing law, but always be willing to, think creatively about challenging the existing barriers to justice and equality. Brilliant writer, always wanting you to, both in writing and in oral advocacy, to express things in a succinct, clear way that gets right to the point, no unnecessary verbiage, but also very supportive. I mean, demanding, challenging, but in a very supportive way. So she wouldn't, in marking up a draft, say, "Oh, that's just wrong. Try again." She would kind of gently pose some challenging questions for you to think more about. And arguing before her, I think my favorite story is when I was arguing before her in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. I had just taught a class in Buffalo the afternoon before. I flew down to Washington. The argument started early the next morning, so I felt like I had sort of didn't have quite all the brushing up time I wanted. And she asked me a question about a very important case. And I had one of those complete, brain wipeouts where I was like, oh God, I know that's a really important case, but I can't remember it. Oh my God, what am I going to do? And, kind of feeling comfortable because I knew her, I just kind of took a deep breath and smiled and said, Your Honor, I'm really sorry, but I am having a complete, brain wipeout. I cannot remember that case. I just admitted it. And she smiled at me and warmly and said, I guess that's what happens when you leave Washington to go to Buffalo, because it was a very important administrative law case that any Washington lawyer knows on the tip of their tongue. And she then gave me a very, polite little couple of words nudge that brought it right back into my mind, and I was able to then give a great answer to the question. And I could see her kind of smiling and nodding her head like, well done, student, well done. And when I argued before in the Supreme Court, which was in fact the clinic access case from Buffalo, and with Planned Parenthood as one of the clients, she a couple times, broke into Justice Scalia, who was predictably trying to skeptically hammer me, to ask very, helpful, kind of supportive softball questions to help me be able to get back on track of my argument and, get the ground back from Justice Scalia. I don't know if she always does that, but I somehow felt in that case, not only because the issue was so important to her, but that, she didn't want her dear friend Justice Scalia to sort of monopolize my time. She wanted to make sure the other justices could hear what I had to say, and she helped make that happen.
And challenge and support you at the same time.
Exactly, very well said. Yes, I mean, it wasn't a super softball question. It was a very important question, but it was one that she knew I could knock out of the park. So so it was actually very, at that point before the Supreme Court, it was for me actually quite reassuring to see her on the bench. Knowing that I had a mentor and an ally up there that would try to sort of save me if I got into the Scalia trap.
Well, thank you so much for taking this time to come back and talk to us again. I know our guests at the All Access event, as well as all the viewers who I'm sure will see this over time, are very grateful for your expertise in this area. Before we cut, is there anything else that you think we should cover that is just in your mind at this moment?
I mean, you said earlier, let's turn to talking about Justice Ginsburg herself, rather than everything being despair and doom and gloom. And I wanted to say to that, as much as we're fighting those feelings right now, and as much as I think Roe is in greater jeopardy than it's ever been before, I think we can't give up. If there is a Democrat in the White House and the Democrats control the House and the U.S. Senate starting next January, Congress could pass a law permitting, allowing access to abortion, and that could trump the laws of states that prohibit it. Conversely, if the Republicans ever control all three branches again, they could pass a law completely prohibiting it, which would override the will of the people of the state of New York and other states. I think influencing legislators, making sure legislators who support women's equality, of which reproductive rights is an essential foundation, always was obviously important, but it's more important than ever now. So I think one of the reasons the women's reproductive equality advocate side has been kind of outmaneuvered by the anti-choice side is that they have been much more likely to make abortion is the one issue, to vote on that issue only, and to even support people who will do other things like destroy the environment and rip children from their parents' arms that they think are horrible. I think the reproductive rights side has not been willing to make preserving women's reproductive rights and therefore women's equality the absolute die-on-a-hill issue for which we simply won't support and vote for anyone who will not commit to that. And if it wasn't clear before, it is definitely clear now that it is time to make women's reproductive health and reproductive rights and equality the die-on-the-hill issue. Otherwise, a lot of women will indeed die on the hill.
Well, thank you so much. And again, I really appreciate you taking the time, and hopefully we don't have to come back here in another week to discuss some additional horrible...
To discuss what Justice Coney Barrett will actually do, or who knows? Yeah, I know.
So thank you.
Okay, thank you.